My entire family turned my career into a punchline right in the middle of a crowded luxury resort lobby. Laughter echoed off the marble walls as my brother-in-law Terrence snapped his fingers directly in my face. He pulled a crumpled $100 bill from his designer wallet and tossed it onto the reception desk. "Go fetch the luggage from the valet, Abigail," he ordered loudly enough for the front desk staff to hear. "You are used to playing the help anyway." My sister Penelope giggled, leaning into his arm, while my parents just smiled, nodding as if this was perfectly normal behavior. They had no idea that the ground they were standing on literally belonged to me. "My name is Abigail, I am 35 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life being the designated punching bag for my family. Before I tell you exactly how that single crumpled bill ended up destroying Terrence and his pristine corporate career, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your city or state in the comments below. And if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of toxic family members, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You are going to want to hear how I handled this one. It was supposed to be a weekend of celebration. My parents, Susan and Richard, had dragged us all to the Azure Cove Resort, an ultra-exclusive coastal property that catered exclusively to the top 1%. They were celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, and my father had made it very clear that attendance was mandatory. I had driven 4 hours up the coast, arriving just as they were checking in. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern architecture, with huge glass windows overlooking the ocean, but all I could focus on was the intense heat rising in my cheeks. Terrence, a 36-year-old African-American man who never let anyone forget he was a senior vice president at a major commercial bank, stood there in his custom-tailored suit, looking at me like I was something he had scraped off his shoe. "Go on, Abigail," he urged, gesturing toward the glass doors. "The valet is waiting. We have 5 bags. Try not to scuff the leather." I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the pristine marble counter. The young woman working the reception desk had frozen her hands, hovering over her keyboard, her eyes wide with secondhand embarrassment. "I can get a bellhop to assist you, sir." The receptionist offered, her voice barely above a whisper. Terrence waved her off without even glancing in her direction. "Nonsense," he said, his voice booming across the quiet lobby. "Abigail needs the exercise. Plus, we all know her little freelance gig barely pays the bills. Consider this a generous tip for your services, Abigail. You can use it to buy yourself a decent dinner tonight instead of eating from the vending machines." Penelope, my younger sister, smoothed down her silk dress and let out a soft, condescending sigh. "Just do it, Abigail," she said. "Terrence is exhausted. He just closed a massive deal at the bank and he needs to relax. You know how stressful real jobs can be. It is not like you have anything better to do. You just run errands for people anyway." I took a deep breath, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. This was the dynamic. It had always been the dynamic. Penelope was the golden child, the one who had her college tuition fully paid, her first car bought in cash, and her wedding funded by my parents' retirement savings. Terrence was the golden son-in-law, the corporate titan who brought prestige to the family name, and I was the scapegoat. The one who had moved out at 18, cut off from any financial support, because I refused to follow the strict career path my father had dictated for me. They thought I was struggling. They thought my job as an independent event coordinator and freelance assistant meant I was living paycheck to paycheck, fighting for scraps. They loved the narrative that I was the failure of the family because it made their own accomplishments look so much brighter. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I calmly picked up the $100 bill from the marble counter. Terrence smirked, expecting me to turn around and walk out to the valet stand. Instead, I reached across the counter and gently placed the bill into the glass tip jar sitting next to the receptionist. "Keep it," I told the young woman with a polite smile. "I am sure you deal with enough difficult guests today." The receptionist blinked in shock while Terrence let out an offended scoff. His face tightened, his arrogant smile vanishing instantly. "Excuse me," he snapped, stepping closer to me. "I did not give you that money to throw away. I gave it to you to do a job. Go get the bags, Abigail." "I am not asking you twice." I turned to face him, directly squaring my shoulders. I am your sister-in-law, Terrence. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I am not your personal assistant, and I am certainly not your bellhop. If you want your bags, you can go get them yourself, or you can wait for the resort staff to bring them to your room. My mother, Susan, stepped forward, placing a hand on my arm. Her grip was tight, her manicured nails digging into my skin. Abigail, do not start this, she hissed, her tone sharp and reprimanding. Terrence is paying for our premium dinner tonight. He is treating this entire family to a luxury weekend. The least you can do is show some gratitude and make yourself useful. Why do you always have to be so difficult? I looked at my mother, seeing the familiar disappointment in her eyes. It was never about what was right or wrong. It was always about keeping Terrence happy because Terrence had the money. Or so they thought. I am not being difficult, Mother, I replied, pulling my arm out of her grasp. I am simply setting a boundary. I drove 4 hours to celebrate your anniversary. I did not drive 4 hours to be treated like a servant by a man who thinks his bank title makes him royalty. Terrence laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. A boundary, he mocked. Listen to you. You are 35 years old, Abigail. You live in a tiny apartment, and you hustle for pennies planning birthday parties for rich housewives. You should be begging me for a job at the bank, not talking to me about boundaries. I could make one phone call and change your entire pathetic life. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing pitch. You are lucky I even let Penelope invite you to these family gatherings. You are an embarrassment. Now go get the bags before I tell the front desk to cancel your reservation entirely. I stared back at him, feeling a cold calm wash over me. The irony of his threat was almost too much to bear. He was threatening to cancel my reservation at a resort that my firm had quietly purchased 3 months ago for $40 million in cash. Every chandelier above our heads, every marble tile beneath our feet, and every paycheck of the staff standing around us was funded by my company. But he did not know that. None of them did. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I simply smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that seemed to confuse him. Cancel it, then, I challenged softly. Be my guest, Terrence. He glared at me, his jaw clenched tight. He turned to the receptionist, slapping his platinum credit card onto the counter. I want her room canceled, he demanded, pointing a finger at me. Right now! She is no longer part of our party. The receptionist looked terrified. She glanced at the computer screen, then back at me, her eyes silently pleading for help. She did not know who I was either. I was listed as an anonymous VIP in the system. Sir, I cannot just cancel a reservation without the manager's approval, the receptionist stammered. Then get the manager, Terrence roared, slamming his fist on the counter. Do you know who I am? I am a senior vice president at Liberty Commercial Bank. I handle accounts larger than this entire hotel's operating budget. Get your manager out here right now. Before the poor girl could pick up the phone, my father, Richard, finally decided to intervene. He did not come to my defense. He never did. Terrence, calm down, my father said, stepping between us. Do not waste your energy on her. Let the hotel staff get the bags. We have bigger things to worry about. He turned to me, his expression cold and stern. Abigail, since you refuse to be helpful, we need to make an adjustment. Terrence needs a quiet place to conduct some business calls this weekend. He is finalizing a massive commercial loan. I am giving him your ocean view suite. You can take the standard room down by the service elevators. I raised an eyebrow. You are taking my room? I asked. You do not need a suite. Abigail, my mother added, rolling her eyes. You are just going to be sitting around anyway. Terrence is actually working. He needs the space. Hand over the key card. Penelope crossed her arms, smirking triumphantly. Come on, Abby. Do not be selfish for once in your life. They stood there, a united front, staring me down, waiting for me to break. They expected me to argue, to cry, to throw a tantrum about the unfairness of it all. They wanted the drama so they could paint me as the crazy, emotional sister who was ruining the anniversary weekend. But I was not that girl anymore. I had spent the last decade building an empire in complete silence, learning how to read people, how to negotiate, and how to recognize when an opponent was handing you the perfect weapon to destroy them. Terrence was digging his own grave, and my parents were handing him the shovel. I reached into my purse, pulled out the heavy gold-plated keycard for the penthouse suite, and placed it gently on the counter. "Of course," I said, my voice smooth and agreeable. "Take the suite, Terrence. I hope you get a lot of work done." He snatched the card off the counter with a scoff of victory. "That is what I thought," he muttered. "Know your place." He grabbed Penelope by the hand and stormed off toward the elevators, my parents following closely behind, like loyal subjects trailing a king. None of them looked back. I stood alone in the lobby, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioning. I pulled out my phone, opened a secure messaging app, and typed a quick note to my executive assistant. "Check the status of the Liberty Commercial Bank acquisition," I typed. "I want to finalize the buyout on Monday morning and find out who holds the corporate card for a Terrence Washington." I hit send, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and walked toward the reception desk to get a new room key. Let them have the ocean view suite for the night. By tomorrow evening, Terrence would not even be able to afford the valet. That evening, the private dining room at the Azure Cove Resort was glowing with the soft light of crystal chandeliers. I walked in exactly at 7 o'clock, wearing a simple but elegant black dress. The room was reserved exclusively for our family, completely separated from the main restaurant by heavy mahogany doors. A personal waitstaff of 3 was assigned just to our table, standing quietly against the silk-lined walls. My parents were already seated at the head of the long, polished table. Penelope and Terrence sat to their right, leaving a single empty chair on the far left side for me. I took my seat quietly, unfolding the crisp linen napkin and placing it on my lap. Nobody greeted me. They were entirely captivated by Terrence, who was currently swirling a glass of expensive red wine and talking loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling. "I am telling you, Richard, the commercial sector of this city is basically sitting in the palm of my hand," Terrence boasted, taking a large sip of his wine. "This new ownership group that just bought out the Azure Cove property, they are coming directly to my division at Liberty Commercial Bank for their financing. It is a multi-million-dollar loan, and my CEO has put me completely in charge of the underwriting. When I close this deal next week, my commission alone will buy Penelope that new vacation home she has been wanting." My mother, Susan, clasped her hands together, beaming at him with absolute adoration. "Oh, Terrence, that is just wonderful," she gushed. "We are so incredibly proud of you. It is so comforting to know that our daughter is married to a man of true substance, a real provider." She turned her head slightly to cast a sideways glance at me, her smile fading into a look of mild pity. "You should take notes, Abigail. Maybe if you focused on building a real career, instead of running errands and planning parties for other people, you could afford to stay in a place like this on your own dime." I smiled politely, reaching for my water glass. I did not bother telling them that the new ownership group Terrence was so desperately trying to secure a loan for was actually my holding company. I also did not mention that my firm had paid for the entire resort in cash, rendering his coveted commercial loan completely unnecessary. I just let him talk, watching him dig a hole so deep he would never be able to climb out of it. "Well, Susan," Terrence said, leaning back in his chair and adjusting his silk tie, "not everyone is built for the high-stakes corporate world. Some people are just destined to serve the people who actually make the big decisions. There is no shame in being at the bottom of the food chain as long as you accept your place." He snapped his fingers in the air, pointing at one of the waiters standing near the wall. "You there," he barked. "This wine is room temperature. I specifically asked for it to be decanted and brought down to exactly 60 degrees. Take this back and bring me a fresh bottle, and do not charge me for this one." The waiter, a young man who looked to be in his early 20s, hurried forward and carefully took the glass. "Right away, sir. I apologize for the inconvenience." Terrence rolled his eyes, muttering about incompetent staff under his breath. I watched the exchange, feeling a familiar knot of disgust tighten in my stomach. This was the man my parents worshipped, A man who measured his self-worth by how terribly he could treat people he deemed beneath him. Once the waiter rushed out of the room, my father Richard tapped his water glass with his silver spoon to get everyone's attention. He cleared his throat, standing up slightly to address the table. Before the first course arrives, Susan and I have a very important announcement to make, my father began. As you all know, this weekend marks our 40th wedding anniversary. Hitting this milestone has made us think a lot about the future and about the legacy we want to leave behind for our family. Penelope sat up straighter, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. She reached over and grabbed Terrence by the hand. For 4 generations, our family has owned the summer estate up the coast. My father continued, his voice thick with pride. It holds a lot of memories for all of us, but maintaining a historic property requires significant capital and serious financial management. We are getting older and we want to ensure the estate is taken care of properly, so we have made a decision. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He slid it across the table, stopping it directly in front of Penelope and Terrence. "We have officially transferred the deed of the summer estate solely into your names," my father announced, smiling broadly. "It is yours. You two are the future of this family, and we know Terrence has the financial resources to keep the property pristine." Penelope let out a high-pitched squeal, grabbing the document and waving it in the air. "Oh my gosh, Dad, thank you so much," she cried. "Terrence, we can finally tear down that awful detached garage and build a proper guest house. We can put a pool in the back." Terrence nodded approvingly, patting my father on the shoulder. "It is a smart business move, Richard. You are making the right choice. Do not worry. I will make sure the property value triples by next summer. I have top-tier contractors on speed dial." I sat completely frozen, staring at the legal document in Penelope's hands. The summer estate. The property that had been in foreclosure 5 years ago when my father's business took a massive hit. The property that I had personally saved from the bank. I put my water glass down, the clink of the crystal ringing loudly in the sudden silence of the room. "Excuse me," I said, my voice quiet, but cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a knife. "You transferred the deed to them." My father sighed, dropping his festive demeanor and looking at me with exhaustion. "Now, Abigail, do not make a scene. We knew you would be sensitive about this, but you have to be logical." "Logical," I repeated, keeping my voice completely steady. "Let us talk about logic then. 5 years ago, the bank was 60 days away from repossessing that estate. You came to my apartment crying because you were going to lose the family legacy. I handed you a cashier's check for $450,000 to pay off the remaining mortgage and the back taxes. I spent 2 whole summers fixing the roof and repainting the exterior with my own hands because you could not afford a contractor." Terrence let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Oh, please, Abigail, do not exaggerate," he scoffed. "Are we supposed to believe a freelance party planner had $500,000 lying around? You probably took out a predatory loan just to play the hero." "She did it to buy our love," Penelope chimed in, her tone dripping with venom. "You always do this, Abby. You do one nice thing and then you try to hold it over our heads forever. It is pathetic. You are just jealous because Mom and Dad know Terrence is the only one who can actually afford the upkeep." "I did not take out a loan, Terrence," I replied, ignoring my sister entirely. "I paid in cash. And we had a verbal agreement, Dad. You said the house would remain in a trust for both Penelope and me." "Verbal agreements do not hold up in court," Sweetie Terrence sneered, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "Welcome to the real world. Your dad made a smart asset protection move. You are 35 years old and still running errands for rich people. You do not even own a home. If you were on the deed, the state would probably put a lien on it the second you fell behind on your credit card bills. You cannot afford the property taxes, Abigail. It is just a fact." My mother reached over and patted my hand, offering me a condescending smile. "Terrence will reimburse you for whatever pennies you spent fixing the roof, Abigail," she said soothingly. "Just give him the receipts. He makes more in a month than you do in 2 years. It is really for the best." I looked at the 4 of them. I looked at the smug satisfaction on Terrence's face, the greedy triumph in Penelope's eyes, and the complete lack of remorse from the parents I had quietly financially rescued. They truly believed I was weak. They truly believed they had outsmarted me. I slowly pulled my hand away from my mother. I reached into my small black clutch and pulled out my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the direct messaging channel to my lead acquisitions attorney. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not demand my money back. I simply typed 3 words: execute the buyout. I hit send and placed the phone face down next to my dinner plate. I picked up my napkin and gently dabbed the corner of my mouth. "You know Terrence?" I said, my voice perfectly calm and conversational. "You really should not count your money before the ink is dry. Sometimes the real world can be very surprising." "Are you threatening me with your imaginary money?" Abigail Terrence laughed loudly, slamming his hand on the table. Penelope joined in a shrill mocking sound that grated on my nerves. "You cannot even afford the property taxes, let alone lawyers. Welcome to the real world, sweetie." Before I could answer, the heavy mahogany doors of our private dining room swung open. The sudden noise made everyone at the table turn their heads. The resort manager stepped inside, holding the door wide open, with a look of absolute deference on his face. Behind him walked a man who instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. It was Harrison Montgomery. At 52 years old, Harrison was a tech billionaire whose face graced the cover of every major financial magazine in the country. He was notoriously elusive, rarely making public appearances, and even more rarely taking on new business partners. Flanking him were 2 men in sharp charcoal suits carrying thick leather briefcases. Corporate lawyers. Terrence stopped breathing. His wine glass hovered halfway to his mouth, his eyes bulging. He recognized Harrison instantly. Everyone in the commercial banking sector knew who Harrison Montgomery was. Landing even a fraction of his corporate accounts was the ultimate career prize, a golden ticket that would guarantee a promotion to the executive board. Terrence slammed his wine glass down, spilling red liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. He shot up from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket with frantic, trembling fingers. He shoved Penelope's chair out of the way, almost knocking her over as he practically sprinted toward the door. Mr. Montgomery Terrence beamed, his voice cracking slightly with desperate excitement. "What an absolute honor, sir. I am Terrence Washington's Senior Vice President at Liberty Commercial Bank. I have been trying to get a meeting with your family office for 3 years." Terrence thrust his hand out, blocking Harrison's path to the table. He stood there, a wide, eager smile plastered across his face, waiting for the billionaire to shake his hand. Harrison stopped. He looked down at Terrence's outstretched hand with an expression of mild confusion, as if someone had just offered him a used napkin. He did not extend his own hand. He did not smile. He simply looked Terrence up and down with cold, calculating eyes. "Excuse me," Harrison said, his voice low and commanding. "You are in my way." Terrence's smile faltered. His hand dropped awkwardly to his side, but he refused to take the hint. He was too arrogant to realize he was embarrassing himself in front of the entire room. "Of course, sir, I apologize," Terrence stammered, taking a half step back. "I just wanted to introduce myself. My bank handles the largest commercial portfolios in the state. Since you are here at the Azure Cove, I assume you are looking into hospitality investments. I would love to buy you a drink and discuss how Liberty Commercial can facilitate your next acquisition. We actually have my in-laws here tonight, celebrating an anniversary. Richard and Susan, please stand up and meet Mr. Montgomery." My parents eagerly pushed their chairs back, standing up with awkward, eager smiles, trying to look like high society elites. Penelope fixed her hair and puffed out her chest, trying to look important. Harrison did not even glance at them. He stepped neatly around Terrence, completely ignoring my parents, and walked straight down the length of the dining table. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was the soft thud of Harrison's expensive leather shoes on the thick carpet. He bypassed the head of the table where my father stood frozen. He walked past Penelope, who was still clutching the deed to my summer estate. He stopped right at the far end of the table, directly beside my single lonely chair. I remained seated looking up at him with a warm smile. "Good evening, Harrison," I said casually, taking a sip of my ice water. "You made good time." Traffic was light on the coastal highway. He replied, his stern expression melting into a respectful smile. He reached out and shook my hand firmly. "It is good to see you, Abigail. I apologize for interrupting your family dinner, but you said the matter was urgent." One of the corporate lawyers stepped forward, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick leather-bound portfolio. He handed it to Harrison, who then placed it gently on the table right next to my dinner plate. "The acquisition is complete," Abigail Harrison announced, his voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "The final wire transfers cleared 10 minutes ago. Liberty Commercial Bank's entire commercial division is officially ours. We bought out the majority shareholders just as you instructed." I heard a sharp gasp from the other end of the table. Penelope's jaw had dropped so low it looked unhinged. My father Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. Terrence was still standing near the doorway, looking like he had just been hit by a speeding freight train. I reached into my purse and pulled out my favorite gold fountain pen. I unfastened the leather strap of the portfolio and flipped to the final page, which was covered in dense legal text and several signature lines. I smoothly signed my name right there, next to my half-eaten salmon. "Thank you, Harrison," I said, closing the portfolio. "I know pushing this through on a Friday night was not easy for the legal team. When the majority owner of the firm asks for a rush job, we get it done," he replied smoothly, stepping back and folding his hands in front of him. I finally looked up at my family. They were staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. Terrence's face had drained of all its color, leaving him looking sickly and pale. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed. "What is going on?" "My mother?" Susan whispered, her voice trembling as she looked back and forth between me and the billionaire standing at my side. "Abigail, how do you know this man? Why is he giving you paperwork?" I folded my hands together, resting them on top of the billion-dollar acquisition document. "It is very simple, Mother," I explained, keeping my tone light and conversational. "For the last 10 years, you all thought I was running errands and planning birthday parties for rich people. You thought I was a freelance assistant struggling to pay rent. You loved that narrative because it made you feel superior." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink into the quiet room. "The truth is, I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex Holdings. We are a private wealth management and luxury asset firm catering exclusively to high-net-worth individuals. Harrison here is my silent minority partner and lead investor." Terrence let out a choked sound, shaking his head frantically. "No," he muttered, stumbling forward a few steps, his expensive suit suddenly looking too big for him. "That is impossible. Vanguard Apex is a multi-billion-dollar firm. They are the group buying this resort. They are the group I have been pitching to all month for the commercial loan." I smiled, looking directly into his panicked eyes. "That is correct, Terrence. Vanguard Apex bought the Azure Cove Resort 3 months ago in cash, which means you are currently standing in my hotel, eating in my private dining room. And as of 10 minutes ago, Vanguard Apex also executed a hostile takeover of Liberty Commercial Bank." I tapped the leather portfolio with my fingernail, the sound ringing out like a judge's gavel. "Which means, Terrence, I am now your boss. And I own the very bank you just promised to use to renovate my summer house." The silence that followed was absolute. The smug superiority they had all worn just moments ago had evaporated completely, replaced by sheer, unadulterated shock. They had spent the entire evening mocking my career, calling me a glorified maid, and laughing at my financial status. They had stolen my property right in front of my face, confident that I was too weak and poor to do anything about it. Now the truth was laid bare on the table. The little errand runner they loved to humiliate was actually the architect of their entire reality. I did not just have more money than them. I literally owned the ground they walked on and the company that signed their paychecks. But knowing Terrence, I knew his fragile ego would not allow him to accept defeat gracefully. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and I had the perfect trap waiting for him. "This is a sick prank," Terrence finally stammered, his voice shaking as he pointed a trembling finger at the leather portfolio. "You hired these people. You printed this garbage off the internet to humiliate me because you are jealous of my success. There is no way a glorified party planner bought Liberty Commercial Bank." He lunged forward, reaching across the table to grab the signed acquisition document. Before his fingers could even brush the leather binder, one of Harrison's corporate lawyers stepped smoothly into his path. The lawyer did not raise his voice, but his tone was like ice. "I highly suggest you step back, Mr. Washington," the lawyer stated calmly. "Touching that document without authorization constitutes corporate espionage and interfering with a federal financial transition. You are already in enough legal jeopardy tonight. I would not advise adding criminal charges to the list." Terrence froze, his hands suspended in midair. He looked at the lawyer, then at Harrison, and finally at me. The reality of the situation was starting to crack through his massive ego, but he still refused to accept it. He pulled his hand back, wiping sweat from his forehead. Mr. Montgomery, Terrence pleaded, turning his attention entirely to the billionaire. "Sir, you are making a massive mistake. You do not know this woman. Abigail is unstable. She is a financial disaster. She was cut off by her own parents at 18 because she could not follow simple instructions. If Vanguard Apex is partnering with her, you are throwing your money away. Let me call my CEO. We can restructure this entire deal. I can handle your portfolio personally." Harrison looked at Terrence with an expression of profound disgust. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket and took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You seem to be operating under a severe misunderstanding, Mr. Washington," Harrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who owned everything in the room. "I do not make decisions for Vanguard Apex. I am a minority shareholder. Abigail is the founder, the chief executive officer, and the majority owner. She built this firm from the ground up entirely on her own. I invested in her company because she possesses a financial brilliance that you could not even begin to comprehend." Harrison paused, letting his eyes sweep over my stunned parents and my sister, who was now trembling in her chair. Furthermore, Harrison continued, turning his gaze back to Terrence. "Abigail's first order of business upon initiating this hostile takeover was to order a comprehensive internal audit of Liberty Commercial Bank's executive spending, specifically your division. What we found was frankly pathetic. You do not run the commercial sector. You are a middle manager who has been inflating your numbers and abusing corporate funds to maintain a lifestyle you cannot afford." Penelope let out a sharp cry, clutching the worthless deed to the summer house against her chest. She looked at Terrence, her eyes wide with panic. "Terrence, what is he talking about?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Tell them they are lying. Tell them you are the senior vice president." Terrence ignored her. His chest was heaving, his face turning a dark shade of crimson. He was trapped in a corner, and like any desperate narcissist, his immediate reaction was to go on the offensive. "You cannot do this to me," he snarled, glaring at me across the table. "I am family. You owe me your respect, Abigail." "Family," I repeated, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "That is a fascinating word for you to use, Terrence. Just 20 minutes ago, I was the help. I was the embarrassment. You threw a $100 bill at me and told me to fetch your luggage. You told me I belonged at the bottom of the food chain. Now suddenly I am family." My mother, Susan, suddenly stood up. The shock on her face had rapidly morphed into a calculating, frantic energy. She smoothed down her dress and walked around the table, placing her hands firmly on my shoulders. I felt my skin crawl at her touch. "Abigail, sweetheart." My mother began, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet affection that I had not heard directed at me since I was a child. "This is just overwhelming news. We are simply shocked, that is all. You kept this a secret for so long. We had no idea you were so successful. We are so proud of you." I did not move. I just stared straight ahead, looking at Terrence, who was watching my mother with a mixture of hope and confusion. Since this is all true, my mother continued, her fingers digging slightly into my shoulders. Then you need to do the right thing for your family. Terrence is your brother-in-law. He has years of experience in the banking sector. You need to put him on your board of directors immediately. You are just a young woman, Abigail. Running a commercial bank is a massive undertaking. You need a strong, experienced man to guide you and keep the wealth in the family. It is the only logical step. I slowly reached up, grabbed my mother's wrists, and removed her hands from my shoulders. I stood up, pushing my chair back, and turned to face her. "Do not ever touch me again," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "And do not ever insult my intelligence by pretending you care about me. You do not want to keep the wealth in the family, mother. You want to keep the wealth in Penelope's hands. You sat there and watched him humiliate me all weekend. You literally told me to take his money to pay my rent. You just gave away the house I paid for to a man who treats me like dirt. You do not get to claim my success now that you realize your golden child married a fraud." My father's face turned purple with rage. "How dare you speak to your mother that way?" Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "She is trying to help you. Terrence is an executive. He knows things you do not." Terrence suddenly let out a loud, manic laugh. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone. "You think you have won?" Terrence spat, his fingers flying across the screen of his phone. "You think you can just buy my bank and fire me? I am a senior vice president, Abigail. I have emergency authorization codes. I am calling the executive board right now. I am putting a freeze on every single account associated with Vanguard Apex pending a federal fraud investigation. I will tell them you used illicit funds. I will tie your company up in litigation for the next 10 years. You are going to lose everything." He hit the call button and slammed the phone down in the middle of the dining table, pressing the speaker icon so we could all hear. The phone rang once, twice. I looked at Harrison and smiled. Harrison crossed his arms, looking highly amused. The line clicked open. A professional-sounding woman answered, but it was not the executive board of Liberty Commercial Bank. "Azure Cove Resort Security and Finance Department," the woman said clearly through the speaker. "This is Director Evans speaking." Terrence frowned, leaning over the table. "What is this?" he demanded. I dialed the emergency corporate line for Liberty Bank. "Who is this?" "This is the Resort Security Office, Mr. Washington," Director Evans replied, her tone entirely unsympathetic. "We actually intercepted your call from the front desk switchboard because we have been trying to locate you for the past 15 minutes. We have a serious problem with your account." Terrence scoffed, rolling his eyes at Penelope. "This is ridiculous. I am a VIP guest. Put me through to my corporate office right now. I have a massive banking emergency to handle." "The only emergency you have right now is with us, Mr. Washington," the director stated coldly. "The Platinum Corporate Credit Card you placed on file to cover the expenses for this anniversary weekend has just been violently declined." Terrence froze. His eyes darted toward the heavy mahogany doors. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "That is a corporate expense account. It has a limitless ceiling. Try running it again. Your machine is broken." "Our machines are functioning perfectly, sir," Director Evans continued. "The card was flagged and permanently deactivated by the holding company that just acquired Liberty Commercial Bank. They attached a note to the decline stating that using bank funds to pay for a private family vacation constitutes gross embezzlement and corporate fraud. We require an immediate alternative form of payment for the $40,000 balance you have accrued so far this weekend. If you cannot provide one within the next 10 minutes, I have been instructed by the resort's owner to have you escorted off the property by local law enforcement." The call disconnected with a sharp click, leaving a dial tone echoing in the silent dining room. I picked up Terrence's phone and held it out to him. "You were saying something about freezing my accounts, Terrence," I asked politely. He stared at the phone, his mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Penelope burst into heavy, hysterical sobs, hiding her face in her hands. My parents stood entirely paralyzed, realizing that the man they had trusted with their legacy was entirely broke, and the daughter they had thrown away held all the cards. I did not sit back down. I remained standing at the end of the table, letting the sheer weight of the moment crush whatever remaining defiance Terrence had left. He was staring at the disconnected cell phone as if it had betrayed him. The absolute silence in the private dining room was deafening. "Let us talk about that summer estate now," I said, my voice breaking the heavy tension. My father flinched as if I had struck him. He looked down at the legal document still clutched in Penelope's shaking hands. "You were so eager to hand over the generational wealth to a man you believed was a financial titan," I continued, walking slowly around the edge of the table. "You told me I was essentially useless, that I could not even afford the property taxes. But you missed a very crucial detail when you transferred that deed, Richard." I stopped right behind Terrence's chair. "When I paid off the $450,000 mortgage 5 years ago, I did not just hand over a cashier's check out of the kindness of my heart. I processed that payment through Vanguard Apex Holdings. We placed a quiet corporate lien on the property to protect the investment. A lien that legally supersedes any backroom deed transfer you try to execute today." My father's face turned completely ashen. "What are you saying?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I am saying the estate does not belong to Penelope," I replied flatly. "And it certainly does not belong to Terrence. It belongs to my firm. And since Terrence just tried to use my corporate assets to fund his luxury vacation, I am officially seizing the property to cover the damages and the outstanding interest." Penelope let out a wail, dropping the deed onto the floor like it was on fire. "Mom, do something," she pleaded, pulling frantically at Susan's sleeve. "She cannot do this. We were going to build a pool. We already hired contractors." Susan was trembling, her eyes darting between me and Harrison Montgomery, who was watching the entire scene with quiet approval. "Abigail, please." Susan begged, her elite high society facade completely shattered. "We are your parents. You cannot take the family home away from us. We gave you life. You gave me life, and then you spent 35 years trying to make me feel completely worthless." I corrected her, refusing to let any emotions seep into my voice. "You enabled a culture of toxicity in this family. You allowed this man to treat me like a servant because you worshipped his bank account. And now that you realize his bank account belongs to me, you suddenly want to play the loving mother. It is too late." I looked down at Terrence. He was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. The arrogance that had defined his entire personality was gone, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. "As for you, Terrence," I said, leaning down slightly, so he could hear every single word clearly, "you are officially terminated from Liberty Commercial Bank effective immediately. You will receive no severance package. My legal team will be filing a formal complaint with the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission first thing Monday morning regarding your blatant embezzlement. Good luck finding a job in the corporate sector ever again." Terrence shook his head frantically. "You cannot fire me," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "I have a lease. I have 2 luxury car payments. I have a lifestyle to maintain." "That is right," I said, straightening up. "You do have a very expensive lease, the luxury penthouse downtown, the one that costs $15,000 a month." Terrence looked up at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "How do you know how much my rent is?" "Because Vanguard Apex owns that building too." I smiled. "We bought the property management company last year. You have been writing your rent checks to me every single month. And since you are now unemployed and facing a massive corporate lawsuit, I highly doubt you will be able to make next month's payment. Consider this your formal 30-day notice of eviction." The sound Penelope made was something between a gasp and a scream. She pushed her chair back violently, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at Terrence. "You told me we were rich," she shrieked, her face red with fury. "You told me we were untouchable. Now we are getting evicted and I'm going to lose my penthouse." Terrence tried to reach for her, but she slapped his hand away. "Do not touch me!" Penelope sobbed, backing away from him. "My friends are going to find out. The country club is going to find out. I am ruined." My parents immediately turned on Terrence as well. Richard stood up, pointing an accusing finger at him. "You lied to us!" Richard shouted, trying to salvage his own ego. "You told us you were a senior vice president. You are nothing but a fraud." "Abigail, we did not know. We were victims of his manipulation, too. I watched my family completely implode. The golden child was throwing a tantrum because her designer lifestyle was evaporating. The golden son-in-law was staring into the abyss of absolute financial ruin. And my enabling parents were desperately trying to throw Terrence under the bus to save themselves, realizing they had alienated the only person who actually had real power." I reached into my purse one last time. I pulled out the crumpled $100 bill that Terrence had thrown at me in the hotel lobby earlier that afternoon. I tossed it onto the center of the dining table where it landed right next to the $1 billion acquisition document. "Here," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Use this to cover your valet. You all have exactly 30 minutes to pack your bags and vacate my resort before I have security physically remove you from the premises." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for their apologies, their excuses, or their tears. I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, Harrison and his legal team falling into step beside me. "Have a pleasant drive back to the city," I called over my shoulder as the doors swung open. "I hear traffic is terrible this time of night." Fast forward 3 months, I never spoke to any of them again. I did not need to. The consequences of their actions handled everything for me. Terrence is currently facing a massive civil lawsuit from the bank and is entirely unemployable in the financial sector. Without his corporate money, he and Penelope were evicted from their penthouse. They had to move into my parents' unfinished basement. My parents are drowning in debt because the summer house they tried to steal was legally seized by my firm. As for me, I am currently sitting in my penthouse office overlooking the city skyline, finalizing a massive new international expansion deal with Harrison. I permanently blocked all of my family's numbers, and I have never felt more at peace. They spent 35 years treating me like the punchline to their joke. But the thing about building your empire in complete silence is that when you finally decide to speak, the whole world has to listen. Have you ever had to cut off the very people who were supposed to protect you? Let me know your story in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and remember, never let anyone determine your worth. I did not yell. I did not throw my napkin onto the table or knock over my water glass in a fit of theatrical rage. Growing up in this family had trained me to suppress my emotional reactions because any display of hurt was immediately weaponized against me. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry and beg for their approval so they could look down on me from their self-appointed pedestals and call me hysterical. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I simply folded my hands in my lap and looked directly at my father. The crystal chandelier above us cast a bright, unforgiving light on his face, revealing the nervous twitch in his jaw. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew it was wrong. "Let us get one thing perfectly straight, Richard," I said, my voice dangerously calm and even. "I am not going to sit here and let you rewrite history to stroke your own ego and impress your son-in-law. You just told this entire room that I could not afford the property taxes on the summer estate. That is a fascinating conclusion, considering I am the only reason you even have a summer estate to give away." Penelope let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Oh my gosh, here we go," she groaned, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "Are you seriously going to bring this up right now, Abigail? Can you not just let Mom and Dad have one nice evening without making it all about you?" I ignored her completely, keeping my eyes locked on my father. 5 years ago, I continued refusing to break eye contact. 5 years ago, this family was 60 days away from complete financial ruin. Your business had tanked. You had taken out second and third mortgages on the summer house to cover your bad investments. The bank was actively drawing up the foreclosure papers. Do you remember that, Richard? Do you remember coming to my apartment in the middle of the night, crying on my sofa because you were going to lose the legacy your grandfather built? My father swallowed hard, his face flushing a deep, guilty shade of red. He opened his mouth to speak, but I did not let him. I did not hesitate. I said, my tone sharp and precise. I handed you a cashier's check for $450,000. I wiped out your debt entirely. I paid the back taxes. I spent the next 2 summers driving up there on my weekends to repair the roof and repaint the exterior because you could not afford to hire a contractor. And when I handed you that check, we had a very clear verbal agreement. You looked me in the eye and promised that the property would be placed into an irrevocable trust shared equally between Penelope and me. Terrence scoffed, leaning back in his chair and adjusting his expensive silk tie. A verbal agreement, he mocked, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. Abigail, surely you are old enough to know that verbal agreements are entirely meaningless in the real world. If it is not on paper, it does not exist. Your father made a strategic asset protection move. You cannot hold a 5-year-old favor over their heads forever. It was not a favor, Terrence, I replied, turning my gaze to him. It was a financial rescue. I saved them from bankruptcy. And why did you do it? Penelope snapped, leaning forward and pointing an acrylic fingernail at me across the table. Why did you really do it, Abby? It was not out of the goodness of your heart. You only paid that money because you wanted to buy their love. You have always been jealous of me. You thought if you swooped in and played the hero, Mom and Dad would finally prefer you. It is actually really pathetic when you think about it. You are so desperate for validation that you emptied your meager little savings account just to manipulate them. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. This was the pinnacle of their gaslighting. They were taking my greatest act of loyalty and twisting it into a character flaw. They were making me the villain for saving them. My mother Susan nodded eagerly in agreement with Penelope. Your sister is right, Abigail, she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. You have always had this need to control situations. We appreciate what you did back then, we really do. But it was not as dire as you are making it sound. We would have figured something out. We had other options. Other options. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. You were a week away from the property going to public auction, Susan. You had 0 options. Well, we have options now, Terrence interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. Look, Abigail, we understand you feel slighted, but you need to look at the bigger picture. You are a freelance event planner. You live in a cramped apartment. You have absolutely no concept of how to manage a historic piece of real estate. If your name was on that deed, it would be a massive liability. The state would probably put a lien on the house the second you fell behind on your personal credit card bills. He reached for his wine glass, taking a slow, arrogant sip before continuing. I, on the other hand, manage multi-million-dollar commercial portfolios. I have contractors on speed dial. I have the liquid capital to actually renovate the property and increase its market value. Your parents are making a sound financial decision. They are protecting the asset. Terrence set his glass down and offered me a pitying smile. But do not worry, he added smoothly. I am a fair man. If you are really hurting for cash that badly, I will reimburse you for whatever pennies you spent fixing the roof. Just have your little business email me the receipts. My bank will cut you a check by the end of the month. Consider it a return on your desperate little investment. I looked at the 4 of them. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from Terrence. I looked at the greedy, triumphant gleam in Penelope's eyes as she clutched the legal deed to her chest. I looked at my parents, who sat there silently endorsing every single humiliating word that came out of Terrence's mouth. In that exact moment, something inside me completely detached. The last remaining shred of hope I had harbored, the tiny, fragile part of me that still wanted a normal, loving family, simply evaporated. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt entirely liberated. They had just given me the absolute moral permission to destroy them. They thought I was a desperate, struggling freelancer who had scraped together her last dimes to save the house. They thought Terrence's commercial bank was the ultimate authority in the room. They had no idea that the bank Terrence worked for was currently in the final stages of a hostile takeover. They had no idea that I was the one executing the buyout. I slowly lowered my hands beneath the table. I unclasped my small black clutch and slid my cell phone out. The screen illuminated my lap with a soft glow. I unlocked it using my fingerprint and opened the encrypted messaging application I used to communicate directly with my executive board. There was a message waiting for me from Harrison Montgomery, my silent partner, and the public face of our corporate acquisitions team. The legal paperwork is finalized. The message read, "We are ready on your signal." I stared at the screen for a fraction of a second. This was the point of no return. Once I sent the reply, there would be no going back. The family dynamic as I knew it would be permanently obliterated. Terrence would lose his job, his reputation, and his power. Penelope would lose her funding. My parents would lose their golden son-in-law. I did not hesitate. My fingers moved swiftly across the digital keyboard. "Execute the buyout," I typed. I hit send. I watched the tiny digital checkmark appear, confirming the message had been delivered and read. The wheels were officially in motion. An empire was shifting hands in the dark, and the people sitting across from me were completely oblivious to the avalanche heading straight for them. I slipped the phone back into my clutch and clicked it shut. The soft metallic snap drew their attention back to me. I placed my hands back on the table, resting them lightly on the white linen cloth. I looked at Terrence, whose arrogant smile was still firmly in place. Then I looked at Penelope, who was carefully folding the deed and placing it into her designer handbag like a prized trophy. "You know," I said, my voice incredibly soft but carrying clearly across the quiet dining room. "It is fascinating how confident you all are in your assumptions. You assume you know my financial status. You assume you know who holds the power in this room." I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the cool liquid. I set the glass down and let my eyes meet my father's terrified gaze. "But if I were you, Richard," I continued, a genuine, relaxed smile spreading across my face, "I would not count your real estate money just yet. Because the real world, as Terrence so eloquently put it, can be very unpredictable. And sometimes the people you think are at the bottom of the food chain are actually the ones who own the entire restaurant." Terrence opened his mouth to reply to my comment about the food chain. His face was twisted into a cruel sneer as his brain scrambled to formulate another string of condescending insults about my financial status. He wanted to put me back in my place, to remind me that I was nothing more than a struggling freelancer in his eyes. But the harsh words never left his throat. Before he could utter a single syllable, the heavy mahogany doors of our private dining room swung open with a smooth, authoritative click. We had explicitly instructed the resort management not to interrupt our dinner service until I personally signaled for the next course to be brought out. My mother, Susan, immediately frowned, her posture stiffening in deep annoyance at the perceived breach of high society etiquette. She turned her head, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to scold whichever unfortunate waiter or busboy had dared to intrude on our exclusive family gathering. She wanted to show off her false sense of superiority by berating the staff. But it was not a waiter who stepped across the threshold. The man who walked into the room commanded an immediate and absolute shift in the atmosphere. He was in his early 50s with distinguished silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit that did not scream for attention but radiated a quiet, immeasurable power. He possessed the kind of effortless authority that only comes from true self-made wealth. This was not the loud, flashy arrogance that Terrence constantly projected to hide his insecurities. This was the real thing. Flanking him on either side were two younger men impeccably dressed in dark navy suits. Each of them carried a sleek leather briefcase and moved with the synchronized precision of elite corporate attorneys. They stepped into the room and took their positions slightly behind the older man, surveying the dining table with cold, analytical expressions. I remained perfectly still in my chair, keeping my face entirely neutral. I did not gasp or turn around in shock. I knew exactly who he was, and I knew exactly why he was here. It was Harrison Montgomery. To the general public, Harrison was a notoriously elusive tech billionaire who rarely gave interviews and almost never made public appearances. He was a phantom in the financial sector, known only through his massive acquisitions and ruthless business strategies. To the corporate world, he was a titan, an apex predator who bought and sold massive global conglomerates before breakfast. But to me, he was my most trusted colleague, my silent business partner, and the lead investor in Vanguard Apex Holdings. I watched the recognition hit Terrence like a physical blow to the stomach. The smug, condescending smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face all evening vanished in a fraction of a second. The healthy color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His eyes widened to the point where they looked like they might pop out of his skull. He knew exactly who had just walked into the room. Everyone in the commercial banking sector knew the face of Harrison Montgomery. For an ambitious climbing executive like Terrence, landing even a fraction of Harrison's corporate accounts was the ultimate white whale. It was the kind of career-defining acquisition that would instantly guarantee a permanent seat on the executive board and a massive 8-figure performance bonus. Terrence had spent the last 3 years desperately trying to secure a simple 5-minute phone call with Harrison's family office, only to be repeatedly rejected and ignored by lower-level assistants. Now the elusive billionaire was standing less than 20 feet away from him in the middle of a private dining room at a luxury coastal resort. Terrence completely lost his mind. He forgot entirely about our heated argument. He forgot about the fraudulent deed to the summer estate currently sitting on the table. He forgot about the fact that he was attending a private anniversary dinner for his in-laws. The only thing his greedy, opportunistic brain registered was the sudden physical presence of an unimaginable fortune and the desperate need to capture it. Terrence jumped up from his chair so violently that the heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floorboards. The sudden aggressive movement startled Penelope, who let out a small, high-pitched gasp and clutched her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest. Without a single word of apology or explanation to my parents, Terrence began to aggressively smooth down the front of his custom-tailored suit jacket. He ran a frantic, trembling hand over his head, making absolutely sure he looked the part of a powerful, successful financial executive. He stepped away from his seat and moved swiftly toward the doorway, completely ignoring the fact that I was sitting directly in his intended path. As he practically sprinted past me, his hip caught the hard edge of my dining chair. He did not say excuse me. He did not apologize. He actually shoved his heavy hand against the back of my seat, pushing me forward roughly so he could squeeze by faster. It was a physical manifestation of exactly how he viewed me. I was just a useless obstacle in his way, completely invisible and entirely unimportant when there was real money to be made. Mr. Montgomery, Terrence called out his voice, pitching up an octave in his desperate, frantic excitement. He crossed the room with his right hand, fully outstretched, a wide, eager smile, stretching painfully across his face. "What an absolute honor, sir. I am Terrence Washington. I am the Senior Vice President at Liberty Commercial Bank." Harrison stopped his slow advance into the room. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting comfortably and casually at his sides. He looked at the sweating, desperate man rushing toward him with an expression of mild, analytical curiosity, as if he were studying a particularly loud and annoying insect that had flown through a window. Terrence did not let the lack of an immediate reaction deter his momentum. He was too blinded by his own towering ego to read the room. He reached Harrison and immediately launched into an unsolicited high-pressure elevator pitch. He was practically vibrating with nervous electric energy, his words tumbling out in a rapid-fire, desperate rhythm that echoed loudly off the crystal chandeliers. "I have been trying to coordinate a strategic meeting with your wealth management team for 3 years." Mr. Montgomery Terrence gushed, his volume entirely inappropriate for the intimate dining setting. "I personally oversee the largest commercial portfolios in this entire state. I know your firm has been actively looking to diversify its holdings into regional hospitality investments and luxury real estate acquisitions. Since you are here at the Azure Cove Resort tonight, I can only assume you are scouting the property for a potential buyout." Terrence took a half-step closer, invading Harrison's personal space in a deeply misguided attempt to project dominance and corporate camaraderie. He puffed out his chest, trying to look physically larger. My dedicated division at Liberty Commercial is actually currently finalizing a massive multi-million-dollar loan for the mysterious ownership group that just bought this very resort. Terrence bragged, his voice dripping with unearned pride. I handle the entire commercial sector for this city. Nobody knows the local financial landscape better than I do. Whatever your firm needs to accomplish, Liberty Commercial can facilitate it overnight. I can handle your entire investment portfolio personally. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, sipping my ice water and watching the sheer, pathetic nature of his display. Just 5 minutes ago, he had been lecturing me about knowing my place in the world. He had confidently told me I belonged at the absolute bottom of the food chain, serving the elite people who made the real decisions. Now he was practically begging on his knees, performing verbal tricks like a trained circus dog, hoping for a tiny scrap of attention from a man he perceived to be his superior. My parents, seeing a sudden golden opportunity to elevate their own social standing, immediately tried to match Terrence's desperate fawning energy. My father, Richard, stood up quickly, buttoning his suit jacket and pasting on a tight, wealthy smile, hoping to look like a patriarch of old money. My mother, Susan, frantically patted her hair, fixing her posture and lifting her chin to look like the matriarch of an elite corporate dynasty. Penelope sat up straighter, pushing her shoulders back and trying to look alluring and important. Terrence, realizing he could use my family as living props in his desperate sales pitch, turned slightly and gestured grandly toward the long table. "We are actually here tonight celebrating a private family milestone," Terrence continued, his voice oozing with fake humility and warmth. "My in-laws, Richard and Susan, are celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. They are one of the most established and respected families in this entire area. Please come in, sir. Join us for a drink. I would love to introduce you to my beautiful wife, Penelope, and discuss exactly how my bank can double your quarterly returns by the end of the fiscal year." He stood there, his hand still hovering in the air, a frantic, hopeful smile frozen on his face, waiting for the billionaire to validate his existence. Terrence stood there with his right hand suspended in the empty space between them, a wide, eager smile plastered across his sweating face. He held that pose for what felt like an eternity, fully expecting the legendary tech billionaire to grasp his hand and welcome him into the upper echelon of the financial elite. He had laid out his title, his bank, and his supposed power right on a silver platter. In his arrogant mind, he was offering Harrison Montgomery the keys to the city. Harrison did not even break his stride. He did not look down at the outstretched hand. He did not offer a polite nod of acknowledgement or a brief smile of corporate courtesy. He simply kept his eyes fixed forward, entirely unbothered by the desperate man attempting to block his path. To Harrison, Terrence was not a senior vice president or a powerful commercial banker. He was an obstacle, an annoying piece of furniture placed awkwardly in the middle of the room. The silence that fell over the private dining room was sudden and suffocating. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic thud of Harrison's custom leather shoes moving across the thick carpet. Terrence's eager smile began to tremble at the corners. His arm, still hovering in the air, twitched slightly as the crushing weight of the rejection started to register. The two corporate lawyers flanking Harrison moved with practiced precision, seamlessly stepping forward to create a physical barrier between their client and my frantic brother-in-law. One of the lawyers, a tall man with a sharp jawline, gave Terrence a single icy glare that silently warned him to back away immediately. Terrence dropped his hand to his side, his fingers curling into a tight fist. But his ego simply could not process the humiliation. He refused to accept that he had just been rendered completely invisible by the very man he worshipped. Panic set into his eyes, and instead of retreating gracefully to his seat, he doubled down in a desperate attempt to save face. "Perhaps you did not hear me over the music," Sir Terrence said, his voice noticeably louder and laced with a frantic, breathless edge. "I am Terrence Washington with Liberty Commercial Bank. I have direct authorization to handle your regional acquisitions." Harrison did not stop. He did not even turn his head. He continued his slow, deliberate walk down the length of the long mahogany table, bypassing the expensive floral arrangements and the crystal wine glasses. Terrence practically scrambled backward trying to keep pace with Harrison while simultaneously gesturing wildly toward where my parents and sister were standing. The scene was incredibly difficult to watch. The man who had spent the entire weekend demanding respect and treating the resort staff like garbage was now begging for a crumb of attention. "Sir, please allow me to formally introduce my family." Terrence stammered, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. "This is my wife Penelope, and my in-laws Richard and Susan. They are a pillar of this community. Richard has extensive holdings in local real estate." My parents, hearing their names, desperately tried to rise to the occasion. They had no idea what was actually happening, but their deeply ingrained social climbing instincts took over completely. My mother, Susan, quickly smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress and adjusted her pearl necklace, lifting her chin to project an aura of old money sophistication. She forced a bright, tight smile onto her face, ready to charm the billionaire. My father, Richard, stood at military attention, practically puffing his chest out as he offered a stiff, dignified nod toward Harrison. Penelope was trying the hardest. She leaned forward, resting one hand elegantly on the back of her dining chair, and flashed the brilliant, practiced smile she usually reserved for country club fundraisers and high society galas. She fluttered her eyelashes, fully expecting Harrison to stop and admire the golden family Terrence was presenting to him. They stood there like mannequins in a luxury department store window, perfectly posed and entirely desperate for validation. Harrison walked right past all of them. He did not glance at Susan's pearls or Richard's dignified nod. He did not look at Penelope's practiced smile. He completely ignored the head of the table where my parents had positioned themselves as the absolute authority figures of the family. He cut through the room like a shark navigating through a school of entirely irrelevant fish. The air rushed out of the room. Terrence stopped dead in his tracks near the head of the table, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked back at my parents, who were still frozen in their welcoming poses, their smiles slowly decaying into expressions of profound confusion and deep embarrassment. Penelope's hand dropped from the back of her chair, her shoulders slumping as the reality of the complete dismissal washed over her. They had been entirely ignored. Not just politely dismissed, but actively, aggressively ignored. In the high-stakes world of corporate power and extreme wealth, there was no insult more devastating than complete indifference. Terrence had offered them his entire identity, and Harrison had treated him like he did not exist. The dead silence was broken only by Harrison's footsteps as he reached the far end of the dining table. He stopped moving. He did not stop next to Terrence. He did not stop next to my father. He stopped directly beside my single lonely chair, the chair my family had purposefully isolated at the very end of the table, so I would be out of their way. The entire dynamic of the room shifted on its axis in a fraction of a second. Every single pair of eyes followed Harrison as he turned his body to face me. Terrence, Penelope, Richard, and Susan all turned their heads, staring in absolute disbelief as the elusive tech billionaire stood respectfully beside the woman they had just spent the last hour treating like dirt. Harrison looked down at me, and the cold, calculating expression he had worn since entering the room instantly vanished. It was replaced by a look of profound professional respect and warm familiarity. "Good evening," Abigail Harrison said, his voice rich, steady, and carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I apologize for interrupting your family dinner, but you signaled that the timeline had been accelerated." I smiled calmly, looking up at him. "Not an interruption at all, Harrison," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Your timing is actually flawless." One of the sharp-suited corporate lawyers stepped smoothly forward, unlatching his sleek briefcase. He reached inside and carefully pulled out a massive, thick, leather-bound portfolio. The cover was embossed with the gold crest of Vanguard Apex Holdings. The lawyer handed the heavy document directly to Harrison, who took it with both hands. Harrison turned back to me and respectfully lowered the portfolio, placing it gently onto the pristine white tablecloth right next to my dinner plate. He placed his large hand flat on the leather cover and looked me directly in the eyes. "The acquisition is complete," Abigail Harrison announced. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a commanding absolute clarity that made sure every single syllable reached the other end of the table. The final signatures were authenticated 10 minutes ago. Liberty Commercial Bank's entire corporate division is officially ours. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. At the other end of the table, my father Richard, who was still holding his half-full wine glass, suddenly lost all the strength in his fingers. The heavy crystal slipped from his grasp. It hit the edge of the mahogany table with a sharp, violent crack before tumbling onto the pristine white tablecloth. The glass shattered, sending a massive wave of dark red wine spilling across the table. It soaked into the expensive linen, spreading out like a pool of blood right in front of the fraudulent property deed they had just tried to steal from me. Richard did not even notice the mess. He stood completely paralyzed, his eyes wide, and fixed entirely on the leather portfolio sitting next to my plate. Penelope's jaw literally dropped open. The elegant, carefully crafted mask she wore to hide her deep insecurities shattered completely. She looked back and forth between me and the billionaire, her brain entirely unable to process the sheer magnitude of what she had just heard. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning a pale, stark white. Susan let out a short, high-pitched gasp, pressing her hand hard against her chest, as if she had just suffered a physical blow. She looked at me with a mixture of absolute terror and complete bewilderment. But it was Terrence who looked the most devastated. He was standing exactly where Harrison had left him, near the doorway, looking like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse in on itself. His expensive suit suddenly looked wrinkled and cheap. His arrogant posture had completely caved in, leaving him looking small and incredibly fragile. He stared at the gold-embossed logo on the leather portfolio. He had spent his entire career trying to climb the corporate ladder at Liberty Commercial Bank. He had built his entire identity, his marriage, and his standing in this family on the absolute certainty that he was the most powerful person in the room. And in 2 short sentences, Harrison Montgomery had just revealed that the bank Terrence worked for, the bank he worshipped, had just been purchased entirely by the woman he had ordered to carry his luggage. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the room was the heavy, ragged breathing coming from Terrence. He was staring at the gold-embossed logo on the leather portfolio like it was a live explosive. The sheer impossibility of the situation was actively short-circuiting his brain. A man whose entire self-worth was tied to his corporate dominance simply could not compute the reality that his absolute lowest target of ridicule had just become his ultimate superior. I watched his hands curl into tight fists at his sides. The pale shock on his face rapidly began to boil over into a deep, furious red. It started at his neck and crept all the way up to his hairline. Instead of taking a step back, instead of realizing he was entirely outmatched and choosing to retreat gracefully, Terrence did exactly what desperate, cornered narcissists always do. He doubled down and went completely on the offensive. "This is a joke," he practically spat the words out, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "This is some kind of sick, elaborate joke. You hired this man, Abigail. You paid an actor to come in here and humiliate me in front of my wife and my in-laws because you are jealous." He took a heavy, aggressive step toward the dining table, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "You think you are so clever," he shouted, his volume echoing harshly off the crystal chandeliers overhead. "But this is pathetic even for you. A glorified maid does not just wake up and buy a commercial bank. You plan birthday parties for a living. You run errands. You cannot even afford the property taxes on a summer house, and you expect me to believe you just executed a billion-dollar corporate buyout." One of Harrison's corporate lawyers shifted his weight, preparing to step between us, but I raised my hand slightly, signaling him to stand down. I did not need protection from a man who was currently digging his own professional grave. "I am perfectly aware of what I do for a living, Terrence," I replied, my voice completely level and devoid of any emotion. "I manage assets. I acquire failing portfolios. And as of 10 minutes ago, I own Liberty Commercial Bank. If you would like to inspect the federal transfer documents, they are sitting right there on the table." Terrence let out a loud, manic laugh that bordered on hysterical. He slapped his hand hard against the back of an empty dining chair. "Documents," he sneered. "Anyone can print fake legal documents off the internet. But let us say for 1 second that this is real. Let us just pretend that the legendary Harrison Montgomery actually walked into this room and handed you a real acquisition portfolio." Terrence turned his furious gaze toward Harrison, looking the billionaire up and down with absolute disgust. He then looked back at me, his lips curling into a vile, malicious sneer. "How exactly did you get your name on that paperwork?" Abigail Terrence demanded, his voice dropping to a low, menacing pitch. "Because we all know you do not have the capital, you do not have the education, you do not have the pedigree, so what did you do? Did you sleep with him? Is that what this is? You are his little mistress playing businesswoman for the weekend." The sheer audacity of the accusation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Penelope let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. My mother, Susan, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting between me and Harrison. She did not immediately jump to my defense. In fact, I could see the wheels turning in her head, wondering if Terrence was actually right. It was far easier for my parents to believe that I had sold my body to a wealthy man than to accept that I had built a financial empire entirely on my own intellect. My father Richard cleared his throat nervously, tugging at his collar. "Now, Terrence, let us not jump to conclusions," he murmured weakly, completely failing to stand up for his own daughter. Harrison stood perfectly still, but his expression hardened into something incredibly cold and dangerous. He looked at Terrence with the kind of absolute disdain usually reserved for a roach on a kitchen counter. "I highly suggest you watch your next words very carefully," Mr. Washington Harrison said, his voice dropping into a quiet, lethal register. "You are currently speaking to the founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Apex Holdings. I am merely a minority investor in her firm. I do not fund her. She generates the capital. She executes the strategy. And she just bought your entire career out from under you. If you ever speak to her with that level of disrespect again, I will personally ensure that your name is blacklisted from every financial institution on this continent." Terrence flinched physically, stepping back as if Harrison had struck him, but his ego was completely shattered, and the humiliation was too much for him to swallow. He was bleeding out professionally, and he wanted to inflict as much damage as possible before he went down. "You are lying!" Terrence screamed, spittle flying from his lips. He was completely losing control, waving his arms frantically. "She is conning you. She is a fraud. I am a senior vice president. I have a master's degree in finance. I know exactly how these acquisitions work, and they do not happen in secret. They do not happen without the executive board knowing." He reached blindly into his custom-tailored suit jacket, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grasp his cell phone. He pulled it out and gripped it like a weapon, holding it up for all of us to see. "You think you can just walk in here and take my bank?" Terrence yelled, his chest heaving with exertion. "You think you can fire me or become my boss? You have no idea who you are dealing with, Abigail. I personally know the chief executive officer of Liberty Commercial. We play golf every single weekend. I am his top earner." He began furiously tapping at the screen of his phone, his eyes wild and unhinged. "I am calling him right now." Terrence threatened, pacing back and forth near the heavy mahogany doors. "I am going to wake him up, and I am going to tell him exactly what kind of scam you two are trying to pull. I am going to have the executive board block this entire acquisition immediately. We will tie you up in so much federal litigation, your fake little company will go bankrupt paying the legal fees." "Go ahead," I offered, gesturing casually toward his phone. "Call him Terrence, but you might want to check the global financial news feeds first. The buyout was finalized and approved by the Federal Regulatory Commission over an hour ago. Your CEO signed the paperwork himself. In fact, part of the restructuring agreement included a very generous golden parachute for him to step down quietly. He does not work there anymore, and neither do the board members you think are going to save you. Terrence stopped pacing. He stared at me, his thumb hovering over the call button on his screen. His breathing was loud and erratic, filling the quiet spaces in the room. He was desperately searching my face for any sign of a bluff, any indication that I was making this up. But I gave him nothing, just a calm, steady gaze of absolute certainty. "You are bluffing," he whispered, his voice cracking. He sounded like a frightened child trying to convince himself that the monster under his bed was not real. "You cannot afford a commercial bank. You are just a glorified maid. You run errands. You are nothing." I stood up from my chair. I moved slowly, deliberately, pushing the chair back and walking around the table until I was standing just a few feet away from him. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not have to scream to be heard. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, Terrence," I said, looking directly into his panicked eyes. "For the last 10 years, you have built your entire identity on the illusion of superiority. You married my sister because this family worshipped your job title. You treated me like garbage because you needed someone to look down on to feel tall. But your entire life is built on debt and corporate funds you do not actually own." I took one step closer, invading his space entirely. "I am not bluffing, Terrence. I own the bank. I own the commercial loans you brag about. I own the building you work in. I even own the corporate credit account you used to pay for this luxury resort weekend, and I am going to systematically dismantle every single piece of the fake empire you have built." Terrence stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The phone in his hand trembled violently. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation was finally crashing down on him, crushing the last remnants of his arrogance into dust. He had tried to gaslight me into believing I was nothing. Instead, he had forced me to show him exactly who I was, and the truth was absolutely terrifying him. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. Terrence stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between me and the heavy leather portfolio resting on the table. He was completely out of ammunition. He had fired his best shots, the insults, the threats, the vile accusations, and none of it had even left a scratch. Then the scraping sound of wooden chair legs dragging across the polished floor broke the tension. My mother, Susan, stood up. She smoothed down the front of her expensive silk dress, a dress paid for by my father's dwindling retirement account, and took a slow, measured breath. I watched her face transform. The shock and bewilderment that had paralyzed her just moments ago vanished, replaced by a chilling, calculating mask of false warmth. She completely ignored the fact that the man standing 2 feet away from her had just accused her own daughter of prostituting herself for corporate gain. She did not reprimand Terrence for his disgusting behavior. She did not demand he apologize for screaming at me. In my mother's eyes, insults directed at me were perfectly acceptable collateral damage as long as the family image remained intact. And now that she realized I was the one holding the keys to the kingdom, the image required a massive, sudden adjustment. "Well," Abigail Susan began, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet maternal affection that made my skin crawl. "This is certainly a massive surprise. We had absolutely no idea you were involved in such high-level corporate dealings. You always kept your little business so quiet. But of course your father and I are incredibly proud of your success." She walked slowly around the edge of the large mahogany table, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She approached me with her hands clasped together, her eyes wide and shining with fabricated pride. "It is truly a blessing," Susan continued, stopping just a few feet away from me, "because this means we can finally consolidate our resources. You have done remarkably well for yourself, sweetheart, you really have. But you must realize that acquiring a commercial bank of this magnitude is a completely different world from whatever it is you usually do. It is highly volatile. It requires a very specific set of skills." I did not say a word. I simply watched her waiting for the inevitable pivot. I knew my mother better than anyone. Her compliments were never free. They were always a down payment on a demand. Which is exactly why you need to do the right thing for your family right now. Susan said, her tone shifting from fake warmth to firm instruction. You need to immediately place Terrence on your new board of directors. In fact, he should be appointed as your chief operating officer by Monday morning. I let out a soft, dry laugh, shaking my head slightly. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious, Abigail. My mother snapped, her maternal mask slipping just a fraction to reveal the demanding matriarch beneath. Be reasonable about this. You are 35 years old. You are a young woman who has spent her life planning parties and running errands. You do not understand the complexities of corporate finance. Women simply do not know how to run massive commercial banking divisions. The stress will destroy you. You will bankrupt this entire holding company within a year without proper guidance. She gestured grandly toward Terrence, who was suddenly looking up, a tiny spark of desperate hope igniting in his eyes. Terrence has the pedigree, Susan insisted, stepping closer to me. He has the master degree in finance. He has the contacts. He knows the executive landscape. He can step in and manage this transition for you. He can do the heavy lifting while you sit back and collect the dividends. It is the only logical step to keep the wealth in the family. You owe it to your sister to protect her husband's career. You have a duty to ensure Penelope maintains the lifestyle she is accustomed to. Penelope, hearing her name, immediately jumped into the conversation. She pushed her chair back and stood up, her face red and blotchy from crying over her lost summer house deed. Yes, exactly, Penelope whined, stomping her foot like a spoiled toddler. Abby, you cannot just steal my husband's bank. That is so incredibly selfish. Terrence worked his entire life to become a senior vice president. You cannot just swoop in with some tech billionaire and take it all away. You need to fix this right now. Put Terrence in charge, give him his bank back. It is the least you can do after lying to us for 10 years. Even my father, Richard, nodded in agreement, leaning heavily against the table. Listen to your mother, Abigail, he chimed in, his voice rough. Family protects family. You have a golden opportunity to elevate Terrence to the absolute top of the financial sector. With his leadership and your capital, this family could be unstoppable. Do not let your petty grudges blind you to good business. I looked at the three of them, forming a united front to protect the abuser, while actively demanding I hand over my empire to him. It was a masterclass in toxic enablement and generational misogyny. They were actively trying to strip me of my achievement and hand it to a man simply because he wore a suit and carried an inflated sense of self-importance. I turned my gaze to Harrison, who was standing silently to my right. He looked absolutely repulsed by my family, but he remained quiet, honoring our agreement that I would handle this entirely on my own. I looked back at my mother. The sheer audacity of her demand was almost breathtaking. Let me make sure I fully understand your logic, Susan, I said, keeping my voice razor-sharp and completely steady. 10 minutes ago, you sat in that chair and watched this man throw a $100 bill at me like I was a stray dog. You watched him tell me I belonged at the bottom of the food chain. You watched him scream in my face and accuse me of sleeping with my business partner to get my name on a legal document. And you said absolutely nothing. You did not defend me. You did not blink. My mother opened her mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand, cutting her off instantly. Do not speak. I commanded, the sheer authority in my voice causing her to snap her mouth shut. You do not get to speak right now. You just told me that women do not know how to run commercial banks. You told me I need a strong, experienced man to guide me. So let us talk about the strong, experienced man you want to put on my board of directors. I turned to Terrence, fixing him with a stare so cold he actually took a physical step backward. When Vanguard Apex initiated the audit of Liberty Commercial Bank prior to the acquisition, I pulled the performance files for every single vice president. I continued, making sure every word echoed clearly in the room. I wanted to see exactly what kind of financial genius I was dealing with. Do you want to know what I found, Mother? Do you want to know what your brilliant son-in-law has actually been doing for the last 3 years? Terrence's face drained of color again. Abigail, do not. he whispered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. Terrence Washington is entirely incompetent, I stated flatly, refusing to grant him an ounce of mercy. His commercial division has been operating at a net loss for 6 consecutive quarters. He has not landed a single major corporate account in over 2 years. The only reason he still had a job before I fired him was because he is incredibly skilled at forging quarterly projections and shifting his department's massive debt onto lower-level managers. Penelope let out a sharp gasp, looking at Terrence in horror. "Terrence, tell her she is lying," Penelope demanded. "I am not finished," I said, raising my voice just enough to drown out her whining. To maintain the illusion of success, to afford that $15,000 a month penthouse and the luxury cars, he has been systematically embezzling corporate funds by abusing his limitless expense account. He has been charging personal vacations, expensive dinners, and designer clothes to the bank for years, including this very anniversary weekend. I turned back to my mother, who was now staring at Terrence with a look of dawning horror. "That is the man you want me to put on my board of directors, Susan?" I asked, a bitter smile touching my lips. "A fraud, a thief, a man who uses corporate money to buy your affection. You think I need his guidance? I built Vanguard Apex from a laptop in a studio apartment into a multi-billion-dollar holding company. I manage the wealth of people who could buy and sell this entire city. I do not need a man to guide me, and I certainly do not need a pathetic, insecure middle manager dragging my company into federal prison." I took a step closer to my mother, forcing her to look me directly in the eyes. "I do not owe Penelope a lifestyle she cannot afford to fund herself," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "I do not owe Terrence a job he is completely unqualified for. And I absolutely do not owe you a single ounce of family loyalty. You lost the right to call yourselves my family the day you decided my worth was tied entirely to my bank account." Susan opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The calculated matriarchal mask had completely shattered, leaving nothing but the terrified realization that she had bet all her chips on the wrong horse. She had sacrificed her relationship with her highly successful daughter to cater to a corporate fraud. And now the bill was finally due. Terrence refused to accept the reality staring him right in the face. Even after I systematically exposed his incompetence, his plummeting division numbers, and his blatant misuse of company funds, his towering narcissism simply would not allow him to surrender. He looked at my mother, who was now visibly trembling in her expensive dress, and then he looked back at me with a wild, feral desperation in his eyes. "Do not listen to her." "Susan," he practically shouted, waving his hands frantically in the air to dismiss everything I had just said. "She is lying. She fabricated those audit reports to make me look bad because she knows I am the only person in this room who can actually threaten her little empire. She is trying to turn you against me because she is terrified of my executive authority." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone again. His fingers gripping the device so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he paced back and forth near the edge of the dining table. "You think you have won, Abigail?" he sneered, his upper lip curling into a vicious snarl. "You think because you manipulated some paperwork and threw some money around that you actually hold the power here? You forgot who you are dealing with. I am a senior executive in the commercial banking sector. I know the federal regulations. I know the legal loopholes. And I know exactly how to stop a hostile corporate takeover dead in its tracks." Terrence stopped pacing and aggressively tapped the screen of his phone. "I am initiating a Title 12 emergency asset freeze," he announced, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. "It is a federal banking protocol designed specifically to halt massive unauthorized transfers of corporate wealth. All it takes is one phone call to the Federal Oversight Board, and every single account associated with Vanguard Apex Holdings will be completely frozen, pending a full government investigation." Penelope let out a small gasp of hope, her tear-streaked face looking up at her husband. "You can do that, Terrence," she asked, her voice trembling. "You can stop her from taking the bank." "Watch me," he replied, his eyes locked entirely on me. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to show fear. He wanted me to apologize and offer him a position on the board to stop him from making the call. I did not even blink. I simply crossed my arms and offered him a polite, encouraging smile. "By all means, Terrence," I said smoothly. "Make the call." He glared at me, entirely unnerved by my complete lack of panic. He pressed the dial button and slammed the phone down onto the center of the mahogany table, hitting the speaker icon so the audio would project loudly across the silent room. He wanted my family to hear him destroy me. He wanted them to witness his absolute dominance. The phone began to ring. The sound echoed harshly off the vaulted ceiling and the crystal chandeliers. One ring, two rings. Terrence leaned over the table, resting his hands on the white linen cloth, a smug, arrogant smirk slowly returning to his face. "Say goodbye to your billion-dollar company, Abigail," he whispered maliciously. "You are about to lose every single dime you have ever made." The line clicked open with a sharp electronic beep. A firm, professional male voice filled the room. "Mr. Washington," the voice said, entirely devoid of any standard corporate greeting. Terrence stood up straighter, puffing out his chest. "Yes, this is Terrence Washington, Senior Vice President at Liberty Commercial Bank," he barked, using his most authoritative, executive tone. "I am calling to immediately initiate a Title 12 emergency freeze on all accounts, routing to Vanguard Apex Holdings. I am officially flagging their recent acquisition as fraudulent and deeply suspicious. Transfer me to the Federal Oversight Director right now." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before the voice returned, completely unmoved by Terrence and his frantic demands. "I am afraid you have severely misunderstood the nature of this phone call, Mr. Washington," the man replied, his tone icy and precise. "You are not speaking to the Federal Oversight Board, nor are you speaking to the executive branch of Liberty Commercial Bank." Terrence frowned, leaning closer to the phone. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice pitching up with sudden confusion. I dialed the emergency override number programmed directly into my corporate phone. "Who is this?" "This is Director Evans," the man stated clearly. "I am the head of security for the Azure Cove Resort." "My father." Richard let out a loud, confused breath. "Security?" my father muttered, looking around the table. "Why is the resort security office answering his corporate phone?" We intercepted the outgoing call through the resort internal network. Director Evans explained, the audio perfectly crisp over the speakerphone. "We have been trying to reach your suite and your private dining room for the last 20 minutes, but your family requested a strictly uninterrupted dinner service. Given the absolute severity of the situation, I instructed the network administrator to reroute your device directly to my desk the moment you tried to make an outgoing call." Terrence scoffed, rolling his eyes and shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "This is completely ridiculous," he snapped. "I do not have time to deal with hotel security right now. I am in the middle of a massive financial emergency. Unblock my phone immediately so I can contact my office. The only massive financial emergency you are currently dealing with is right here in this building." Mr. Washington, Director Evans countered, his voice dropping to a low, uncompromising register. 10 minutes ago, the Platinum corporate credit card you placed on file to cover the expenses for this anniversary weekend was violently declined by your banking institution." Terrence froze. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered across his face vanished entirely. He stared down at the glowing screen of his cell phone, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. "That is impossible," Penelope shrieked, leaning over the table. "That is a corporate expense account. It has a limitless ceiling. Terrence pays for everything with that card. You must have run the numbers wrong. Try it again." "We ran it 3 times, ma'am," Director Evans replied sharply. "The card is permanently deactivated. Furthermore, it was not simply declined for a lack of available funds. The holding company that just acquired Liberty Commercial Bank placed a hard manual stop on the account. The specific decline code attached to your profile flagged the card for gross embezzlement and the unauthorized use of corporate funds for personal luxury expenses. The blood drained completely from my mother Susan's face. She looked at Terrence with wide, terrified eyes. Embezzlement, she whispered the word barely escaping her lips. That is correct. Director Evans continued relentlessly. According to the directive we received from the bank's new ownership, any further attempts to use that card constitute federal fraud. Which brings us to your current outstanding balance, Mr. Washington. Terrence swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Balance, he choked out. Yes, sir, Director Evans said, reading from a digital file. You reserved the Ocean View penthouse suite for 3 nights. You booked premium spa packages for 2 guests. You demanded the VIP private dining room and pre-ordered 3 bottles of vintage wine that cost $5,000 each. The current accrued balance for your weekend stay is exactly $42,800. Penelope let out a strangled sob, covering her face with both hands. $42,000, she wailed, her voice muffled by her trembling fingers. We require an immediate alternative form of payment. Director Evans stated his tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. We need a personal credit card or a verified wire transfer initiated within the next 10 minutes. If you cannot provide alternative funding to clear this debt, I have been instructed by the owner of this resort to take immediate action. Terrence was visibly shaking now. He reached out to grab the edge of the table, trying to physically steady himself as his entire world collapsed in real time. I do not have a personal card on me, he stammered, his voice small and pathetic. My personal accounts are tied up in investments. Just put the charges on a temporary hold. I will sort this out with my bank on Monday morning. You no longer have a bank to sort this out with, Mr. Washington, Director Evans reminded him coldly. An Azure Cove resort does not offer temporary holds for guests flagged for corporate embezzlement. You have exactly 10 minutes to provide a valid payment method. If the balance remains unpaid at that time, local law enforcement officers who are currently waiting in my security office will be dispatched to your dining room. You will be formally arrested and escorted off the premises in handcuffs for defrauding this establishment. The call disconnected with a sharp, heavy click. The dial tone hummed loudly in the private dining room, filling the suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The reality of the situation crashed down on them like a concrete block. Terrence had not just lost his job. He had not just been humiliated. He was 10 minutes away from being dragged out of a luxury resort by the police in front of hundreds of elite guests. Terrence slowly looked up from the phone. He turned his desperate, terrified eyes toward my parents. Richard, he pleaded, his voice cracking completely. Richard, you have to help me. Put your credit card down for the room. Just cover the balance for tonight, and I promise I will pay you back. I will sell one of the cars. I will empty my retirement fund. Please, Richard, you cannot let them arrest me. My father stared at Terrence as if he were looking at a venomous snake. The man who had spent the entire weekend worshipping Terrence's corporate success was now physically backing away from him. Are you out of your mind? Richard shouted, his face turning purple with absolute outrage. I do not have $42,000 in liquid cash to spend on a hotel bill. You told us this entire weekend was paid for. You told us it was a corporate perk. You lied to us. You stole from your company to impress us, and now you want me to foot the bill to keep you out of jail. Susan burst into heavy theatrical tears, clutching her pearl necklace. We are ruined, she sobbed, rocking back and forth in her chair. Our reputation is completely destroyed. Everyone at the country club is going to know our son-in-law was arrested for embezzlement. How could you do this to us, Terrence? We trusted you. I stood at the end of the table, watching the absolute carnage unfold. They were turning on each other like starved animals. The golden family dynamic they had spent years meticulously crafting and using to torture me had completely vaporized the moment the fake money ran out. Penelope grabbed Terrence by the lapels of his wrinkled suit, shaking him violently. "Fix this!" she screamed, her face contorted in pure panic. "Fix this right now, Terrence. I am not going to let the police arrest my husband. Call someone. Call your parents. His parents do not have that kind of money." "Penelope," Terrence yelled back, finally snapping under the pressure and pushing her hands away. "I do not have that kind of money. Nobody has that kind of money, except her." Terrence slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant, powerful executive was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified man facing the absolute destruction of his life. He looked at the crumpled $100 bill he had thrown at me in the lobby earlier that day, still resting on the table next to my billion-dollar acquisition portfolio. The sheer poetic justice of the moment hung heavy in the air. The trap had fully sprung, and there was absolutely no way out. I did not offer him a lifeline. I looked down at the pathetic, terrified man who had spent the entire afternoon treating me like a disposable servant and felt absolutely nothing. The frantic desperation in Terrence's eyes was a silent plea for mercy, but he had long ago exhausted any right to my compassion. The private dining room was suffocatingly quiet, the air thick with the smell of the expensive red wine my father had spilled across the white linen tablecloth. I finally moved. I pushed my chair back, letting the wooden legs scrape loudly against the polished floorboards. The sudden harsh noise made Penelope flinch violently in her seat. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream or posture the way Terrence did when he wanted to feel powerful. True power is quiet. It relies on facts, not volume. I walked slowly around the edge of the large mahogany table until I was standing directly in front of the heavy leather portfolio Harrison had delivered. I rested my hand flat against the gold-embossed cover. "You demanded proof, Terrence," I said, my voice perfectly level, carrying clearly across the silent room. "You stood there 10 minutes ago and screamed that I was a fraud. You accused me of sleeping my way onto a legal document because your fragile ego could not comprehend a woman outsmarting you. You wanted to see the federal paperwork. Let us review it together right now." I unfastened the thick metal clasp and flipped the heavy leather cover open. The crisp parchment pages rustled loudly in the quiet room. I bypassed the preliminary executive summaries and turned directly to the finalized terms of the acquisition. Pursuant to the federal buyout agreement finalized and authenticated this afternoon, I read aloud, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. Vanguard Apex Holdings has successfully acquired a 68% controlling majority stake in Liberty Commercial Bank. Effective immediately, this acquisition includes full executive oversight and absolute operational control of the Commercial Lending Division, the Human Resources Department, and all internal auditing protocols. I looked up from the document. Terrence was staring at my moving lips as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Do you understand what that means, Terrence?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "It means that every single commercial account you manage, every loan you have underwritten, and every fraudulent expense report you have submitted for the last 3 years now belongs entirely to my firm. I own your professional history. I own your performance reviews. And as the new majority shareholder, I have the absolute legal authority to liquidate your position without severance." Terrence swayed slightly on his feet, grabbing the back of Penelope's chair to keep himself upright. "But my bank account is not the only thing you have been lying to this family about." I continued, turning another heavy page in the portfolio. "Let us talk about your lifestyle. Let us talk about the wealth you love to throw in my face." Penelope let out a wet, ragged gasp, wiping her mascara-stained cheeks with the back of her trembling hand. "Stop," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, Abby, just stop. You have made your point." "I am not finished." "Penelope," I replied coldly, refusing to break eye contact with her. "For the last 2 years, you have made sure every single conversation at every family gathering revolves around your beautiful luxury downtown penthouse. You constantly bragged about the floor-to-ceiling windows, the private elevator, and the $15,000 monthly rent. You refused to let me park my 10-year-old sedan in your visitor garage because it was an eyesore to your wealthy neighbors. You hosted lavish cocktail parties and asked me to pass out appetizers to your friends, pretending I was hired help. My mother, Susan, looked away, staring at the wall in profound shame. She remembered those parties. She had encouraged Penelope to treat me that way because it made the family look aristocratic. Vanguard Apex Holdings is not just a financial acquisitions firm, I read aloud, moving to the second section of the portfolio. We are a diversified asset management company. That means we manage luxury, commercial, and residential real estate across the state. Specifically, we own and operate Zenith Property Management. The name of the management company dropped into the room like an anvil. Terrence's eyes widened in fresh horror. He knew that name intimately. Yes, Terrence, I said, offering him a sharp surgical smile. Zenith Property Management, the holding company that owns the Grandview Tower, the building where you currently lease your penthouse suite. Penelope looked back and forth between Terrence and me, her brain struggling to put the pieces together. What does that mean? Penelope whispered, her voice shaking. Terrence, what is she talking about? It means, Penelope, I answered for him, that for the last 2 years, every single time your husband wrote a rent check to maintain your illusion of high society, that money was deposited directly into my corporate accounts. I am not just your sister. I am your literal landlord. I own the roof over your head, the private elevator you love so much, and the garage you banned me from entering. The sheer magnitude of the revelation hit Penelope so hard she physically slumped forward in her chair, resting her forehead against the edge of the mahogany table. She let out a long, hollow wail of absolute despair. Her entire identity, her entire sense of superiority had been funded by the sister she had spent a lifetime treating like garbage. Terrence looked like a man standing on the gallows, waiting for the floor to drop. You cannot evict us, he stammered, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. We have a lease. We have tenant rights, Abigail. You cannot just throw us out on the street. I turned the final page in the real estate section of the portfolio. Actually, Terrence, I corrected him, tapping the paper with my index finger. Your luxury lease includes a very standard morality and financial solvency clause. Since your rent payments have been made using Liberty Commercial Bank executive accounts, and those accounts are now frozen due to your federal embezzlement charges, you are officially in breach of contract. Zenith Property Management issued a formal 30-day notice of eviction to your unit exactly 1 hour ago. The paperwork is currently taped to your front door. I closed the heavy leather portfolio with a resounding thud that made both of my parents jump. You have 30 days to clear your belongings out of my building, I stated, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or mercy. After that, the locks will be changed, and anything left inside will be sold at auction to cover the damages you caused to my commercial bank. My father, Richard, stared at me, entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant man who had demanded I give up my hotel room just a few hours ago. He looked at the portfolio, then at Harrison, who was still standing silently by the doorway, watching the execution with quiet, professional approval. Abigail Richard started, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate parental manipulation. You have proven your point. You are a massive success. We were wrong, we admit it. But you are talking about putting your own sister on the street. You are talking about ruining her life. You cannot destroy your own family like this. It is cruel. Cruel, I repeated, turning my attention to the man who had enabled every single moment of abuse I had endured since childhood. You want to talk to me about cruelty, Richard? Cruelty is watching your eldest daughter struggle to pay her way through college and refusing to help her because she did not choose the career you wanted. Cruelty is sitting at this table and giving away a summer house I paid for to a man who treats me like a dog. Cruelty is watching your son-in-law throw a $100 bill at my face and telling me to be grateful for the tip. I pointed a finger directly at Terrence, who was now staring blankly at the floor, completely broken. I am not destroying this family, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I am simply holding up a mirror. Terrence destroyed his own career by stealing corporate funds. Penelope destroyed her own lifestyle by marrying a fraud and refusing to work a single day in her life. And you destroyed your relationship with me by choosing their fake money over my loyalty. All I did was buy the bank. The rest of this disaster belongs entirely to you. Terrence tried to look anywhere but at me. His eyes darted frantically around the private dining room, searching for some kind of escape hatch. He looked at the 3 waitstaff members standing quietly against the silk-lined walls. They were the very same people he had spent the last hour berating and treating like absolute garbage over the temperature of his wine. Now they were watching him completely unravel their faces, entirely devoid of sympathy. He then looked toward Harrison Montgomery, desperately hoping for some twisted form of wealthy male solidarity. But Harrison just stared back at him with the cold, detached expression of an undertaker. There was no one left to save him. The fake empire he had used to terrorize me was officially crumbling into dust. I turned my body fully toward him, standing tall. I wanted every single person in this room to witness what happened next. I wanted there to be zero ambiguity about who held the power. Terrence Washington. I said, my voice sharp and authoritative. I am speaking to you now not as your sister-in-law, but as the majority shareholder and acting chief executive officer of Liberty Commercial Bank. He flinched physically, shrinking back against the table. Based on the preliminary findings of our internal audit and the direct confirmation of your gross misuse of corporate expense accounts, I continued, my words slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. Your employment at Liberty Commercial Bank is terminated. This termination is effective immediately. You are stripped of your title, your executive privileges, and your security clearances. You cannot fire me without a formal board hearing. Terrence choked out, his voice sounding thin and reedy. I have a contract. I have rights. You have to give me severance. I have unvested stock options. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the leather portfolio. You do not have a contract anymore, Terrence. You breached it the moment you decided to use bank funds to pay for your luxury hotel suite. And as for your severance and your stock options, they are permanently frozen. My legal team will be seizing every last dime of your accumulated corporate assets to compensate for the hundreds of thousands of dollars you have embezzled over the last 3 years. If there is a remaining balance after we liquidate your accounts, you will be billed directly. If you fail to pay, my firm will press federal criminal charges, and you will go to prison. The absolute finality of the statement hit him like a physical blow. His legs gave out. He collapsed heavily into his dining chair, his expensive custom suit bunching up awkwardly around his shoulders. He buried his face in his hands, his chest heaving, as the reality of his complete financial and professional ruin washed over him. Seeing her husband completely broken triggered something feral in Penelope. The golden child who had never faced a single consequence in her entire 33 years of life completely lost her mind. She began sobbing hysterically, her manicured hands tearing at her perfectly styled blonde hair. "Mom, make her stop!" Penelope shrieked, turning her tear-streaked face toward Susan. "Make her give it back. You told me he was rich. You told me I was marrying a provider. He is broke, Mom. I am going to be homeless. I cannot live in an apartment. I am a VIP member at the country club. Everyone is going to laugh at me." My mother, Susan, sat completely frozen, unable to process the sheer velocity of the disaster. Her precious social standing, her entire identity as the matriarch of an elite family, was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand toward Penelope, but could not find any words of comfort. There was no comfort to give. The money was gone. My father, Richard, desperately tried to stop the bleeding. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his face pale and slick with sweat. He held his hands out in a placating gesture, trying to project the calm, paternal authority he had completely surrendered years ago. "Okay, Abigail. Okay," Richard stammered, his voice shaking badly. "You have won. You proved you are the smartest person in the room. You took his job, And you took his apartment. But we can still fix this. We are still a family. We can compromise. I raised an eyebrow, staring at him in complete disbelief. A compromise, Richard? You want to negotiate with the woman you just tried to banish to a standard room by the service elevators. Please just listen to me, Richard pleaded, taking a desperate step toward me. We still have the summer estate. Susan and I just gave them the deed tonight. We can sell the property. It is worth over $1 million in today's market. We can liquidate the house and use the cash to pay off Terrence's debts to your resort. We can use the rest to keep him and Penelope afloat until he finds a new job in a different sector. We can make this right, Abigail. You do not have to put your sister on the street. I looked at my father and felt a deep, hollow wave of pity wash over me. He was so desperate to maintain his illusion of control that he was completely ignoring the facts I had already laid out on the table. Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register. Did you genuinely not hear a single word I said to you 10 minutes ago? Or is your arrogance simply blinding you to reality? My father stopped, his confused eyes darting between me and the fraudulent deed still resting near Penelope's plate. I did not pay off the $450,000 mortgage on that summer house out of the goodness of my heart. I reminded him, speaking slowly so he could absorb every single syllable. I processed that payment through Vanguard Apex Holdings. I placed a quiet corporate lien on that property 5 years ago to protect my investment because I knew you were financially reckless. Richard swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. That means Vanguard Apex holds the primary debt on the estate, I continued. And since Terrence just defrauded my bank and currently owes my resort $42,000 for this ridiculous anniversary weekend, I am officially foreclosing on that lien tonight. Your deed transfer is completely worthless paper, Richard. You cannot sell a house you no longer own to pay off debts to the person who actually owns it. The last remaining pillar of their false empire collapsed. The summer house was gone. The penthouse was gone. The executive banking job was gone. The limitless corporate credit cards were deactivated. In less than 20 minutes, I had systematically stripped away every single asset they used to make themselves feel superior to me. They were completely and entirely bankrupt. Penelope let out another agonizing wail, dropping her head onto the table and sobbing uncontrollably. Terrence did not move. He just sat there, his face buried in his hands, completely defeated. My mother covered her mouth with a trembling hand, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. I looked at the four of them sitting in the ruins of their own arrogance. They had spent my entire life treating me like a punchline. They had mocked my career, my apartment, and my independence. They had demanded I carry their luggage and surrender my hotel room because they believed they were royalty, and I was the help. I reached down and picked up my small black clutch from the table. I snapped it open and reached inside, pulling out the crumpled $100 bill Terrence had thrown at me in the hotel lobby earlier that afternoon. The very same bill he had ordered me to use to buy myself a decent dinner instead of eating from a vending machine. I walked over to where Terrence was sitting. I held the crumpled bill in my hand, staring down at the top of his head. I tossed the money onto the table. It landed perfectly, sliding across the white linen and coming to a stop right next to the pool of spilled red wine and the worthless deed to the summer house. Here I said, my voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. Use this to cover your valet. Terrence slowly raised his head. His eyes were red and completely hollow. He stared at the $100 bill as if it were a physical weapon. You all have exactly 30 minutes to pack your bags and vacate my resort, I announced, addressing the entire table. If any of you are still on the property when the clock runs out, Director Evans will dispatch local law enforcement to your rooms. You will be escorted off the premises in handcuffs for trespassing and defrauding a commercial business. I did not wait for their tears. I did not wait for their desperate apologies or their frantic promises to change. They had run out of time, and I had run out of mercy. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the heavy mahogany doors. Harrison Montgomery and his corporate lawyers immediately fell into step beside me, their expressions projecting complete professional dominance. As I reached the doorway, I paused for just a fraction of a second, listening to the sounds of my family completely imploding behind me. Penelope was screaming at Terrence. Susan was crying out to my father. It was the sound of a toxic dynasty tearing itself apart. I stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, and the heavy doors swung shut behind me, cutting off their voices entirely. I took a deep breath of the cool air-conditioned air, feeling an immense crushing weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in 35 years, I was entirely free. Exactly 3 months have passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Azure Cove Resort dining room swung shut behind me. I did not look back. I did not answer the dozens of frantic voicemails left on my phone the following morning. I simply boarded a private flight back to the city with Harrison and got right to work restructuring my newly acquired commercial bank. I completely detached myself from their reality. The fallout for my family was swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. There was no need for dramatic confrontations or lingering emotional arguments. The legal and financial consequences handled everything with cold, absolute precision. Terrence was formally arrested by local authorities that very night. Director Evans made good on his promise the exact second the 30-minute deadline expired. Terrence was escorted through the luxury lobby of the resort in handcuffs while hundreds of elite guests watched in silence. Today, he is facing a massive civil and federal lawsuit from Liberty Commercial Bank for gross embezzlement and corporate fraud. Our internal auditing team uncovered even more financial discrepancies once we gained full access to his division's records. To cover the damages, we legally liquidated his unvested stock options and seized his corporate retirement accounts, leaving him with absolutely nothing. Because the fraud charges are a matter of public federal record, he has been permanently blacklisted from the entire financial sector. He tried applying for mid-level management positions at smaller regional branches, but every single background check flagged the Vanguard Apex legal filings. The arrogant man who loudly bragged about running the city's commercial sector and holding the keys to the economy is now completely unemployable. Without Terrence's corporate expense accounts and his highly inflated salary, their meticulously crafted house of cards collapsed overnight. True to my word, Zenith Property Management enforced the eviction notice on their luxury penthouse. Penelope desperately tried to fight it, attempting to hire a lawyer to leverage her tenant rights. But the morality and financial solvency clauses in luxury corporate leases are completely ironclad. On day 30, the locks on the Grandview Tower penthouse were officially changed. Penelope and Terrence were forced to pack whatever designer clothes and luxury items they could fit into their cars and move directly into my parents' unfinished basement. The contrast of her new reality was devastating. Penelope's elite country club membership was immediately revoked due to unpaid monthly dues. The wealthy friends she used to entertain at her lavish cocktail parties, the same friends she used to show off for while treating me like hired help, stopped returning her calls the moment her eviction became public knowledge. She spends her days living underground in a damp concrete room, entirely dependent on the parents she thought she had financially outgrown. Her golden child status means absolutely nothing when there is no gold left to fund it. My parents are not faring much better. Richard and Susan are currently drowning in crippling debt. The week following the anniversary dinner, my legal team officially foreclosed on the coastal summer estate. We took full legal possession of the property, enforcing the corporate lien I had placed on it 5 years prior. My father was furious. He tried to hire an expensive attorney from his country club circle to contest the seizure, hoping to validate the fraudulent deed transfer he had handed to Penelope. He quickly learned a very harsh lesson in corporate law. His backroom deed transfer held absolutely zero weight against a prior recorded financial claim held by a multi-billion-dollar holding company. To pay his rapidly mounting legal fees for a case he had no chance of winning, Richard had to take out a high-interest loan against their primary residence. The generational wealth he was so desperate to protect, the legacy he valued more than his own daughter, was completely wiped out. It was destroyed by his own blind arrogance and his absolute refusal to see Terrence for the fraud he truly was. Richard and Susan are now trapped in a house they can barely afford to maintain. They are living right above the entitled golden child and the fraudulent son-in-law who ruined their retirement. The toxic dynamic they spent 35 years cultivating has finally turned inward, consuming them entirely. They have no one left to blame, and no scapegoat left to carry their burdens. I removed myself from the equation, and without me there to absorb their dysfunction, they were forced to absorb it themselves. I never received a genuine apology from any of them. I did receive several long rambling emails from my mother attempting to play the victim and begging me to reinstate Terrence for the sake of family unity. I did not read past the first few lines. I simply forwarded the emails to my legal department with strict instructions to issue a formal cease and desist order. I permanently blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and their social media profiles. I severed the ties completely and surgically. I do not feel a single ounce of guilt. I gave them every opportunity to treat me with basic human decency. I saved them from bankruptcy. I showed up to their events. I tolerated their insults and their constant belittling. They chose to view my kindness as a weakness to be exploited. They chose to align themselves with a man who offered nothing but empty promises and stolen money. They made their bed, and now they have to sleep in it. As I sit here today, the view from my penthouse office is entirely unobstructed. The floor-to-ceiling windows look out over the sprawling city skyline, a stark, beautiful contrast to the dark, unfinished basement, where my sister currently resides. The sun is just starting to set, casting a warm, golden light across my massive mahogany desk. Across from me, Harrison Montgomery is quietly reviewing the final legal drafts for our next major corporate expansion. We are officially acquiring a massive chain of boutique luxury hotels across the coast, and the negotiations have been absolutely seamless. There is no yelling in this room. There is no arrogant posturing or desperate scrambling for dominance. There is only mutual professional respect and a shared vision for building the future. My personal cell phone sits quietly next to my keyboard. It has not rung with a single toxic demand or manipulative guilt trip in 90 days. I permanently blocked all of my family's phone numbers, their email addresses, and their social media accounts the very moment my plane touched down in the city 3 months ago. I did not leave a forwarding address, and I instructed my building security team to immediately deny entry to anyone sharing my maiden name. The silence that followed was not lonely or isolating. It was the most profound, peaceful sound I have ever experienced in my entire life. I had spent my youth exhausting myself trying to earn a seat at a family dinner table where I was never truly wanted. It took me 35 years to finally realize that I possessed the power to simply stand up, walk away, and build my own table. I look down at the bustling city streets far below my office window, and I feel a deep, overwhelming sense of closure. I am not the family scapegoat anymore. I am not the freelance errand runner or the glorified maid they desperately wanted me to be. I am the architect of my own life, and I absolutely refuse to let anyone else hold the blueprints ever again. I want to take a moment to speak directly to anyone watching this who might be trapped in a similar dynamic. They spent 35 years treating me like the punchline to their cruel joke. They underestimated me at every single turn because keeping me small was the only way they could make themselves feel powerful. But the thing about building your empire in complete silence is that when you finally decide to speak, the whole world has to listen. Have you ever had to cut off the very people who were supposed to protect you? Have you ever had to draw a hard, devastating line in the sand and walk away from toxic family members to save your own future? Let me know your story in the comments below. I know exactly how isolating that choice can feel, and I want to hear how you found your freedom. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their current environment does not have to be their final destination. And remember, never let anyone determine your worth. Thank you for watching.